Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining the second in a series of IR35 webinars that Kingsbridge are going to be producing in the coming weeks and months. I'm just going to give a few more minutes for everybody to join this webinar. I can see that quite a lot of you are already on the webinar session now, so just give it a few more minutes and let a few more people filter through. Okay, there's a few more of you joined now, so I think we'll make a start. I think first of all, the introductions. So myself, my name's Ryan, I am the IR35 project manager here at Kingsbridge, and I'm also joined by my colleague Matt Tyler, who is the IR35 consultancy manager here at Kingsbridge. I'm happy to say that I'm also joined by James Poyser, who is CEO of inniAccounts and founder of the IR35 watchdog site Off-payroll.org. I'm hoping that many of you on today's session will be already familiar with Off-payroll.org and the very, very interesting insight that you got into client behaviour in the run-up to April 2020. Just a few bits of housekeeping before we get into the session. The webinar is expected to last for roughly an hour. We're going to cover a few main topics, one being the Paul Hawksby IR35 tribunal that we've recently seen this year. We're going to cover off some of the minor status tests and how they can affect you as the contractor and what you can do in actually approaching your end client with regards to those. And we're going to look at some IR35 predictions for April 2020 or April 2021 as it now is, following the year's delay. We're going to finish off with some industry FAQs before a live Q&A with the panel here. So throughout the webinar you'll see in the comments section that there's the ability to type. You can fire away any questions that you have throughout the session in that commentary box there. We'll try and get through as many as we can at the very end, and any that we can't get through, we'll just try and endeavour to get back to as many of those as possible after the session is finished, where we'll be sending out both a recording of the session and also the FAQs with a few of the Q&A answers in there as well. Well, I think a good place to start is probably just by covering off really kind of where we are up to. So maybe just a kind of short background on IR35 for those who are kind of just discovering this, which I hope there isn't many. But IR35 was essentially introduced in 2000, designed really to combat the concern at the time that the government had, which was that somebody could leave work as an employee on a Friday, only to return the following Monday to do relatively the same job, just engaged as a consultant, paying substantially reduced tax and national insurance. So the UK's IR35 legislation, in short, just ensures that a contractor pays the same tax and national insurance contributions as an equivalent employee. So what's happening in April 2021 is that new changes will be implemented that will transfer the responsibility of assessing IR35 status from the contractor to the large or medium-sized company, i.e. the end client, for that contractor's supply chain. The 2021 reform also brings the private sector rules in line with what's already happened in the public sector, where this same reform was implemented in 2017, as well as really the kind of new responsibility of actually determining status being passed to the end client. There's a new tax liability or a transfer of tax liability onto the fee payer in the supply chain. So this would be the end client if the contractor was to be actually engaged directly with the end client. But if there is an intermediary involved or an agency in the chain, then the agency would therefore become the fee payer. In some circumstances, that liability can move from the fee payer to the end client if the circumstances are in a kind of certain set of ways, and the legislation means that that's possible. But in essence, genuine contractors should still be able to carry on working outside of IR35 come April 2021, providing that they're being assessed correctly for the purposes of IR35 status. And in the main, good recruiters are happy to place genuine contractors outside of IR35. And we'll look to work with their end clients to actually determine the status of these individuals and helping their end clients to overcome the reasonable care requirement. I guess from kind of what's happened this year, we have seen a upper tier tax tribunal case. That's the case of Paul Hawksby, which James, I mean, do you want to touch on kind of what happened there and what Mr. Hawksby's case actually kind of entailed?
Yeah, I guess the thing is, so from a contractor's point of view, the reason why that one has been particularly interesting is because obviously it went to the first tier tribunal, which ruled in Paul's favour, and then HMRC took it back to the upper tribunal, and it went in HMRC's favour. And it's one of those things that you kind of, something that kind of swung it in the first tier was then overturned, and it was the strength of something else in the upper tier that pushed that into the revenue's favour and determined that the Paul's inside IR35. And it's one of these things. It kind of, we can kind of sweat the details because things like Moo and Control were part of those cases. But if you just kind of sit back and look at that and think, crikey, we're sweating the subtleties of the legislation here and allowing it to go back and forth between an inside and outside IR35 determination. It just goes to show that actually the IR35 is pretty complex and nuanced in places. And it's not surprising that end clients and agents are now kind of turning around and thinking, right, we need some help here to get on and start understanding what the impact's going to be and try and get a clearer path, because it's one of those things. I mean, we look at other tribunal cases that have come through where it's been kind of a lot more clearer cut, and it's kind of it's set the way for determinations going forward. But I say this one's been the interesting one because of the subtleties. It really is. It's one of those things. If you're interested in the details of IR35, following this case is very, very interesting. But to an outsider, I think it's somewhat baffling the reasons why it went back and forth.
Yeah, I'd also add on to that. It just, as essentially you indicated, it kind of shows that it's very much opinion does differ between individuals doing the reviews and the such, and it doesn't help that HMRC really doesn't provide much clear guidance when it comes to IR35 in the first place, leading to situations like this. It is a complex bit of legislation at the end of the day, but HMRC really doesn't help themselves when it comes to resolving cases to do with IR35. So everyone has to try and establish things based off case law in past, which then leads to issues like this arising in the future because there is no clear guidance.
Yeah. How do you think, James, that the uncertainty with the first tier tax tribunal and the upper tier really not giving clarity to the industry, do you think that some agencies and end clients are going to look at that and be even more worried now that they're kind of looking and going, there isn't enough sort of, clarity from the courts, we're not getting clarity from HMRC, what direction should they look to turn in?
Yeah, I think, so the way we kind of approach IR35 when we're talking to our clients, so we deal predominantly with consultants and contractors, and we talk about IR35 a lot, and the kind of the advice that we give to our clients is to think of IR35 as a scale, and at one end you are strongly and definitely inside IR35, and at the other end you are strongly and definitely outside IR35. And if you ask 4 different people, so if you ask the contractor, if you ask the client, the agent, the end, the end client, HMRC, everybody would kind of plot that particular engagement at a different point along that scale. And obviously, contracts and consultants will probably think of them being closer to outside IR35, and the revenue at the end of the day, they're responsible for driving up the tax revenues, and they want as many people inside as possible. So the clear-cut cases where you're definitely inside or you're definitely outside, they're really straightforward. And at the end of the day, if it's a clear outside or a clear inside, they won't make it through the court system because there's just there's no point. It wouldn't get to a first tier tax tribunal. So remember, the only things that we see coming through the courts are the ones where there is a genuine kind of difference of opinion, which tends to be around the middle of is it inside, is it outside. And you can understand where end clients may come from, which is actually if there's a bit of ambiguity and we're not confident they're inside or outside, the cautious thing to do is to go for an inside IR35 determination, because nobody's going to take you to court for pushing somebody inside IR35. So it's kind of that default fail-safe option is to go for inside IR35, which is all well and good. But then if you're unable to place the resource that you need because other people are able to assess fairly and change working practice to get outside IR35, then it's almost a kind of a position where you're scoring a bit of an own goal, because it might be a safe position, but you might not be able to get the resource that you need. And I guess the other thing as well is that so think about some of these cases that have come through. So we've had the Paul Hawksby case, we've got kind of Lorraine Kelly. And it's quite a clever approach by HMRC, because I don't think anybody can name a famous IT contractor, but people can now name famous contractors such as Lorraine Kelly and Paul. So these are high-profile cases where they know that they're going to get coverage and people are going to talk about these cases because it's household names that are involved. But remember, this isn't representative of the entire kind of population of IR35. In many cases, it's a lot more clearer cut as to whether you're inside or outside IR35, and we just tend to hear about those tougher, more interesting cases where they do go through the courts.
And presenters are definitely one of those, because as due to the nature of their services, they'll often struggle to show that they've got a lack of personal service requirements, which a lot of IT contractors, for example, will be able to more easily satisfy. So as you say, the presenters and the odd cases are the ones that are going to be sort of big tribunal cases, and they're often not clear cut from the off, which is why they cause a lot of concern, a lot of doubt between contractors when they start seeing them. But in the majority of cases, it is fair to say that a lot of contractors will be very clearly inside or outside.
Yes.
I think one thing that I've definitely heard Head of Tax Andy Bessie mention previously is, something that you've mentioned there, James, that, going to a first tier tax tribunal or upper tier tax tribunal is not the norm. Certainly from Andy's number, he's kind of defended upwards of about 550 IR35 inquiries, and only 2 have actually gone to a tribunal stage.
Yes.
So in terms of where these things are settled, the majority of the time, HMRC and the contractor or the party that's actually defending the contractor do not want to go to the first tier tax tribunal. They don't want to get that far. Quite often, these things are actually settled way before any of that happens. But it is those cases where it's really unclear what the status is that will happen or could happen with. And certainly where you see it with the presenters, there's another aspect to this that, as you say, HMRC, whether it's on purpose or not, or intended, but the press coverage that some of the tabloids give of Lorraine Kelly, Paul Hawksby, Eamon Holmes, is that they are aggressively participating in tax avoidance. So the likes of banks and other large companies may see that and go, well, we don't want to be tainted in looking like we're aiding tax avoidance by supporting contractors. So I think some of these kind of decisions are kind of made with that in mind, and whether it's intentional or not from the revenue, who knows? I think only they can answer to that, which I'm sure we'll never receive an answer on.
Yes, and that's it. And it's not in there. HMRC are never going to publish statistics on the number of investigations they've opened and haven't made it to the courts, and they haven't been successful in their investigation. And that's the point of that 550 number. And you remember you're talking about Kingsbridge, one firm here looking after 550 contracts who've been investigated, and you expect it's probably a magnitude more than that who've been through those investigations and successfully appealed against HMRC. But it's not in their interest to talk about that, and that's why we see these high-profile cases coming through. I mean, it's kind of it's one of these things. I mean, so as a firm, we're really passionate about allowing people who can genuinely work outside IR35 to work outside IR35. So those people who are business on their own account, they've got that mindset to think, actually, I am running a small consultancy firm here, and I have got a business mindset. And it's a real shame that the whole of this sector is getting demonized as a result. I've long held the view that there are quite a few people who have been inside IR35 all along, and come April 2021, it is going to be very difficult and very unrealistic for them to think that they'll be operating outside IR35. But then similarly, there is a cohort of people who should genuinely be outside IR35. I speak to our own clients, and the way they organise their businesses, the way they run themselves, you feel like you are speaking to a business owner, not somebody who's just trying to crank a handle and pay as little tax as possible. And it's and these are this kind of this vibrant community of consultants and contractors who go in there, solve big problems, take on risk, and walk away and go to the next client and do the same thing. And it's just a real shame that they all get wrapped up in this bad press, and we aren't celebrating as a nation this really diverse and agile workforce that we've got. But there we go. It's down to HMRC. They have a single mind objective, which is around tax take, and it's not their job to talk about how wonderful contracts and consultants are and the value they bring to our country.
Yeah, I'd definitely second that opinion. I mean, I spend my days day in, day out reviewing contractor status, and in my experience, the vast majority of contractors are outside of IR35. There are small things in what they do that they could fix or improve upon, granted, but the big ticket items like levels of control, lack of personal service required, mutuality of obligation, as much as HMRC likes to pretend that doesn't exist, all of those quite often go in the favour of the contractor. And there could be like little niggling bits on the edge of control, or like the minor status test, which we'll move on to in a little bit, that could, impact a contractor's status. But the core aspects are generally very solid.
Yeah.
So
just thinking then, Matt, about those minor status tests. Obviously, we've touched briefly on the Paul Hawksby case, but do you want to give us an insight into what those kind of minor status tests entail, and perhaps how some of them were used in the Paul Hawksby case in the final decision? I know that one thing that was kind of mentioned was the fact that obviously Paul Hawksby was with TalkSPORT for 18 years, and he was classified as being financially dependent on them for a living. Do you want to give us your take on those elements?
Yeah, I mean, the length of duration of the contract, I think that one, I think you'd be hard pressed to find two consultants that specifically agree on any one aspect of length of contract. I've always had a long held belief that length of contract doesn't have much of a bearing on IR35, so long as you are consistent in how you're approaching your IR35 status. If you maintain the barriers between yourself and your client's staff, and there's always an offer and acceptance of work, and it's never just assumed that things will continue on forevermore, then, continuing it as a particular client for a long period of time isn't necessarily a problem. So I do find it a little bit curious that it was brought up as a bone of contention, if you will, in the Paul Hawksby trial itself in the upper tier tribunal. Because I've always held that length of contract, not really a huge indicator, so long as I say, things are done properly.
And I guess the challenge always with with a long contract or successive renewals, it's the slipping into bad habits that's the challenge, isn't it? It's the over time thinking, screw it, I'll go and eat in the canteen. I'll go to that away day because I like these guys, and I'll go to the pub and I'll accept that beer, and so on and so forth. And just over time, it's the things that can then start to add up. So if you're in those long contracts, or the successive renewals, it's about making sure that you're continuously stepping back and just making sure that nobody could suggest that you are part and parcel of that client, and that you are genuinely in business on your own account. But to your point, it's not that the long contract that's a problem. It's the bad habits that could come as a result of being there for such a long time.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the times with the length of duration, as you say, it is part and parcel that causes the problem. A big one that comes up every year around Christmas, unsurprisingly, is attending Christmas parties. The generally seen sort of advice for that is that it just shouldn't be done for a contract outright. But I think allowances can be made if the contractor ensures that they pay their way for any of that. So, for example, if it's £100 per head, the contractor pays the amount for that, and that they don't get paid for the time spent attending that Christmas party, because then it could be argued that it's more of a networking affair. That sort of thing is different to how you might expect to operate. Like a lot of contractors, when they get offered to go to a Christmas party, will just think, go on then, that's fine whatsoever. But it's having that business mindset on it. Does this look like I might be receiving an employee benefit that you need to consider? Same thing with receiving training from the client. It's never really a good thing, but it can be defendable so long as you're not being paid for the time spent attending, and again, you pay your way for that training. It's things like that, considering again whether or not it looks like a genuine business-to-business arrangement, that a lot of contractors take for granted, which is a lot pointed, to be fair, towards the minor status tests that we look at. Financial risk is another big one, for example. I'm always of the opinion that if you were to extend the key status test to have 4, then it would be financial risk that would be the 4th biggest aspect of IR35. It's not a key status test, but it is a very important aspect of determining a contractor status. Is the contractor responsible for correcting defective work at their own costs? Are they required to carry business insurances? Do they have any large overheads like an off-site office, or do they invest substantially into materials that are used up in the provision of the services? All of those sorts of things could be quite large indicators when it comes to IR35, and can help a contractor significantly that contractors don't immediately think of. Because to be fair, and it's important that it is drilled home, a lot of the focus goes on the major status tests, the lack of personal service, control, mutuality. But there should be some focus given to the more what's referred to minor status tests, because they can be quite helpful in proving your case in respect to IR35. If the big three are in the balance, not one way or the other, it falls back on the minor status tests, which are often the ones, all said and done, the contractor has more control over.
And that's it, isn't it? It's kind of the, often when I talk about IR35 with clients, it's kind of like, it's that Venn diagram, that intersection of a couple of things, which is, you've obviously got the contract, the working practice, and there's the bits that the contractor and consultant can't influence, and there's the bit that they can influence, and to focus on that. And it's these things where it sounds like that aligns with what we're talking about here with the minor status tests. And again, it's that thing kind of pressing home. When I talk to our clients about it, we say it's really kind of capturing and embodying that mindset of being business on your own account, because if you can get into that mindset, everything else can kind of start to follow. So if you're a business engaging in a business-to-business relationship, what are the kind of things that you would do? What are the behaviours that you would show? Where would you invest your money? Would you spend your money on being as productive as possible through tools, hardware, software? Think about the business case for renting a dedicated office. Because it's probably not going to take you that much to get a payoff in terms of renting an office if it has an uplift on your productivity. And these are the kind of things that you would think as a business owner, rather than just being a straight employee worker. So yeah, and it's kind of that point is to think about those things that you can influence, focus on them, and get into that mindset of being in business on your own account.
So we just to kind of step back slightly. So we've kind of mentioned what the three major tests are. So we've obviously got substitution, control, and mutuality of obligation. Matt's covered a couple of examples around kind of those minor status tests, but I think if I could, from both of you really, I think we'll start with you, Matt. Let's go over, so give us some examples of minor status tests, both in the contractual terms that a contractor may have, and then also in the working practices. And then James, it'd be great to get from you where you've kind of seen some of those practical examples happening as well, because I think you're in the unique position that you're dealing with the contractors from the kind of accountancy arm, which is obviously one side of things that we necessarily don't see that angle of. We're kind of predominantly dealing with the contractor directly and working the status with them.
Yep.
So Matt, do you want to give us an idea of what that looks like in a contractor's contract and working practices?
There's a whole range of different ones there could be. I think, honestly, you could probably talk for about half a day about how many minor status tests there are. But we can highlight a couple of them. The one that comes up quite a lot when I'm speaking to contractors specifically is the belief that providing your own equipment automatically puts you outside of IR35. Not the case, but it can be helpful to provide your own equipment unless there's a legitimate reason why you can't. For example, I had somebody who works on heavy plant equipment. It would be unreasonable for the contractor to provide their own, heavy plant equipment to do the work. So there's a reason why they can't provide that equipment. More IT-focused example, you could have somebody who works on servers that are located on the client site. They can't bring their own servers in. That just wouldn't work. It's completely unreasonable. So the contractor has to use the equipment on the client site. They don't provide their own equipment because they can't. Yeah. But if there's, for example, if the contractor is developing an app from an external location, there's no reason why the contractor can't use their own software, their own laptop, their own work mobile, that sort of thing. Because there's no issue from a GDPR or data protection perspective. And there's no risk of security because it's all contained within the contractor's architecture. Yeah. Whereas, obviously, if they're working on banking and finance, completely the opposite situation occurs. Everything has to be controlled and on site. So there is a legitimate and legal reason why the contractor can't provide their own equipment in that situation.
What's your take on some of the minor status tests, James, and what kind of examples of it might you see from an accountancy perspective?
Yeah, so we kind of so from my point of view, there's obviously there's kind of the three main tests, but then in terms of the minor ones, we've when we talk to our clients, we kind of bunch it into three, which is the business on own account, ensuring that you're not part and parcel of your client's organisation, and financial risk that we've touched on, and so financial risk. Fine, we've spoken about that and the things that you can do. Part and parcel is about the kind of the mindset and approach that you're on site. But the business on own account is the most interesting one. That's the place about, it's the mindset shift. It's the spending your money in the right places, positioning yourself as being genuinely a boutique consultancy firm, not just that guy who's a little bit all right at that particular skill. And chatting to our clients, and it's we have absolutely terrific clients who are really ahead on IR35. And I spoke to somebody a couple of weeks ago, and they've been with us for a number of years. Typical journey. They were a contractor with a specific skill, and over the last couple of years, they've seen what's been going on with IR35. So they've changed the name of their company. So typical IT contractor with a company name that was named after themselves. Changed the company name a couple of years ago into something that's more generic. Invested in branding. Employed their partner to run the office. They've hired a dedicated desk in a local hot desking centre. They've repositioned themselves as a boutique consultancy firm, so he's no longer kind of a pair of hands to hire. He's somebody who goes in there and solves specific problems. They do a lot of work in the public sector as well, so they've been kind of well practiced in this. They're now pushing themselves to get onto government approved lists of suppliers for the particular skills that they have. And you can just tell there is something very different about the way that they are now thinking, which is, we are a small consultancy firm who will go in there and deliver a specific piece of work and solve a particular problem. It's not about me being a pair of hands for hire. So they're renting those desks. They're investing in hardware. They're investing in branding, and we're seeing more and more of these examples. We as a firm, we use contractors and freelancers quite extensively to help us deliver, and we use one particular consultant, and he's invested in his branding. And when we go on a Zoom call with him, it's not his name, it's his company's name, and his avatar is his company's logo. Everything is signed off, branded by his company, and he talks about all the other stuff that he does. So he's a PMO consultant, and he's getting himself featured in publications. He's writing training courses and delivering online training. So it's just interesting that he's taking that skill where traditionally that would have been a contract role a few years ago, and turning it into something much bigger and more interesting. And it's very obvious that if you looked at him, he's definitely running himself as a business, not just, say, turning that handle and being a contractor, getting paid for a job and trying to figure out how they can, get the money out as quickly as possible. That mindset is really starting to shift by the people who are kind of leading this pack. And that kind of comes back to what we're saying right at the top of this about being passionate about supporting those people who are genuinely outside IR35, who are running these businesses, to allow them to continue to operate in that way. So yeah, certainly from an accounting point of view, business on own account and seeing where people are investing their money, be it in branding, domain names, getting that out there as much as they can, websites, even social media presences, so hiring people to help them to tidy up LinkedIn profiles and position themselves as people who are solving problems rather than it just looking like a CV, right through to things like we've seen branded pitch decks from clients, so and CVs that are replacing CVs with brochures and pitch decks. Insurances are obvious ones. We spoke about officers, training, certification, thinking about the business case. If there's a qualification that you'd like to do, but it's going to cost you a few grand to do it, well, think about it as a business investment. Are you going to get a return on it? And if you are, go for it. If you've got the cash in the business, invest, because if you're investing in a qualification where there's risk associated with it, brilliant, because that's what businesses do. So as a business owner, I would love a crystal ball that would tell me that every single pound that I spent would deliver me a return, but it just doesn't work like that. So we all take risks, and it's the same for this cohort of consultants and contractors who are really grasping IR35 these days.
Just to add on there as well, a very, very simplistic thing that a contractor can do to help their situation when it comes to IR35 is actually start talking in a more business-like manner. So they're not your line manager or anything like that. They're your client contact. They're your liaison, if you will. You're not been engaged, or rather, you're not been employed to do a job. You've been engaged to provide services. Small changes like that can start the ball rolling as to how contractors begin to think of themselves more like what they actually are, compared to the employees that a lot of, shall we say, large entities try to think that they are.
We're obviously talking about this from the perspective of the contractor, but with the changes coming up, there'll be a lot of contractors that think, well, why am I having to do so much work in this? Why am I having to put all of these different things in place and have business insurance and have, you know, all these different checks on status done independently away from your process? What things, thinking more along the minor status test route, what things can end clients and recruitment agencies do to help that contractor and help aid those minor status tests?
Well, I guess one of the first things, again, just goes back to the point that I just mentioned. You got to look at how you're engaging the contractors as a more sort of top-down view to start off with. Are you intending to treat them more like employees, or are you actually going to treat them like a contractor, a business? When you engage a plumber at home, for example, you don't order them about and tell them how to do the job. You say, my toilet's broke, fix it, and then that's it. Businesses should be treating contractors in exactly the same on the same basis. This project needs doing, get to it. Yeah, they shouldn't be hovering over the contractor's shoulder and tell them exactly how to do that, because at the end of the day, the contractor's the expert.
Yeah, absolutely. And just, kind of building on that, so between now and April 2021, so some of the advice that we're offering to our clients is, remember, at some point between now and April 2021, somebody's going to sit down and determine your status. Somebody has got to do it. And what we saw this year, in the first quarter of this year, is that there are hiring managers inside client organisations who are filling out questionnaires, which then ultimately lead to a status determination. So we're kind of saying to our clients, actually, you really need to be pressing home that you are genuinely a business and helping your hiring manager to understand that. So if they say to you, oh, you've done a great job this week, you can knock off early on Friday, it's just that polite reminder to say that's not how you operate. And it's all those little things, and just sow that seed and constantly remind your end client that they are engaged in a business-to-business relationship, and you aren't just another pair of hands, another worker. Because there's a question there, which is, whose responsibility is it to help clients to get into that right mindset, to understand that they are engaging in a business-to-business relationship, not just an employer-employee relationship? And I think all parties have got a part to play there. Is that if an end client is serious about wanting to attract the best talent and be able to attract people with these specialist skills, which are going to lend themselves being outside IR35, then they're going to have to understand how to engage them in a way which minimises risk for everybody. And similarly, the consultants and contractors themselves, there's a lot that they can do between now and April to help their clients to understand this as well.
Yeah, that's something which one client that I'm currently working with has actually implemented to try and aid that process, because what they've done is they've gone down the route of actually getting a whole host of different coloured lanyards and sticking the word contractor on them, and they're trying to help the end client understand that when this person's on site, they're actually a proper visitor. They're a contractor. They're not engaged as an employee. They are different to the average person that might be on site who would be an employee. So these are all types of things that I think agencies, consultancies, and clients should be pushing, should be doing more to make it not just in contract terms alone mean that this person is a independent contractor. They need to look like a contractor, and by changing the way they act, by changing the kind of mentality that both parties have, that goes a long way, certainly initially, in obviously evidencing that. So looking ahead, kind of beyond April, so we're skipping ahead to April the 20th, whenever we want to say in the future. What do you think's likely to happen when the clock strikes midnight on the big day? What do you think's likely to kind of happen from a contractor perspective? What are contractors likely to face?
Yeah, I mean, it's. I think with the backdrop of COVID and what it's done to the market, it really, it's kind of its best guess territory at the moment, isn't it? Because one of the challenges with COVID, it's really upset the kind of the supply and demand mechanic. Because we know there's a lot of contractors who are on the bench at the moment because of coronavirus, and this is the thing, isn't it? Is that so the argument that we've long held is that there's a real kind of supply and demand dynamic on IR35 and status, and if you're the kind of contractor who's in a role where you're more junior, lower barriers to entry, you're more likely to be subject to control from your client's point of view, and there isn't a huge incentive for a client to change working practices because there are plenty of other people who can fulfill that role, then it's going to be very difficult for you to find yourself outside IR35. But on the flip side, I mean, even right now, so I know that the contracts and consultants have had a very, very rough few months, and we've had pretty horrid market conditions. But saying that, what we have seen, there's certain skills, so things like cybersecurity, digital transformation, collaboration tools. So contracts and consultants who've got those skills, day rates have absolutely rocketed because that's where large organisations are scrabbling to fill resource at the moment. So if you're in that kind of position where you've got this niche in-demand skill, you're going to be in a much better position to have a conversation with your client and your agent to talk about working practices and making sure that you can secure that engagement in an outside IR35 manner. Whereas if you're in a more junior role, you're just not going to have that kind of influence. So we've long forecasted this idea of it turning into a kind of a two-track, two-tier market, where it should eventually settle out to roles that are clearly inside IR35 and clearly outside IR35. There is obviously another dynamic, which is certain sectors, that's just not going to apply. And banking and finance is the prime one, where I spoke to a client of ours who works in banking, and they said, do you know what, the banks, they don't really mind getting it wrong as long as everybody else got it wrong as well. So it's that herd mentality, and we saw it this year. It was just, it wasn't even an inside IR35 thing. It was just a blanket ban on PSCs and pushing everybody down the umbrella route. And it doesn't really matter how great your skills are if you're in an industry where you can't overcome that fundamental barrier. But then again, for as many people who are stuck inside banking and finance because their skills aren't transferable, there are plenty of contracts and consultants who do have transferable skills, who can look at other sectors where they're taking a more pragmatic and fair approach to IR35. So on the whole, in terms of what we think is going to happen in April 2021, hopefully this year was a warning shot, and end clients and agencies will start to think sooner rather than later about IR35 status determinations. I think we're ultimately going to end up in this two-tier market, and ultimately it will be beneficial for everybody because it should bring more clarity about everybody's status.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I mean, we can look at April 2017 actually as being a fairly good example of what might happen. Admittedly, a lot of people in the public sector, which is what I'm referring to by April 2017, jumped ship at the time into private sector because there was no hint of this coming in the private sector at the time. But there was a bit of upheaval at the start, but then it very quickly came quite ordered. And as you say, inside-outside determinations were made on engagements. Everything went back to normal within a reasonable amount of time. Private sector obviously was pushed back from 2020 to 2021. So hopefully this time round there won't be quite as big as an upheaval because people have had a trial run at it. They've seen what they need to do and they've started preparing. That's the big thing. Agencies now, or at least what we're seeing, is that agencies are taking it a little bit more seriously this time round than they did in April 2020, which is only a good thing.
James, I wanted to touch on something that obviously you'll be very familiar with, the explosion of Off-payroll.org. Obviously, we've seen with the build up to April 2020, a lot of companies that got it wrong, and a lot of publicity around those that got it wrong for good or bad reasons. What companies and what kind of examples have you seen of end clients or recruitment agencies getting it right? So the kind of good news stories that that you particularly seen at offpayroll.org.
Yeah, I think so. So we did a really interesting piece of work on the Off-payroll website, which is We've developed a pretty strong following. So we went out to contractors and consultants and we said, right, tell us what does, well, the first question we asked is what's more important to you, a fair determination or being outside IR35? It's a really interesting question. It helps you to understand where somebody sits on a scale between valuing fairness and just, absolute maximisation of take-home pay. And 70% of contractors and consultants said that they value a fair assessment ahead of actually being determined outside IR35. So by going through a fair process, that's the most important thing that contractors and consultants want. So then the next question was, right, okay, great. So 71% say that a fair assessment is really important to them. What does that actually mean? And what we found, so the top three things, the top four things were, the first one was being individually assessed. So we all saw these blanket and role-based assessments. We spoke before about that intersection, that Venn diagram where it's what's in the contract, and then think about that specific contractor, their working practices and what they're doing. So contracts and consultants want that individual assessment, so they have their opportunity to kind of put their case forward and for the factors that they can influence to be taken into account. So that was the first bit. The second part was about experts undertaking assessments. So right at the beginning of this webinar, we spoke about the complexity of IR35, and it is a complex domain. And we saw a lot of companies basically, asking, somebody to go on a half-day training course internally, and then start dishing out IR35 status determinations, which was an absolute disaster, because you're dealing with contractors and consultants, and many of them can remember when this first came in almost 20 years ago. So they've got a huge amount of experience in IR35. They worked very, very hard to manage their IR35 status, and somebody goes on a half-day training course and thinks they're an expert. So that was a hugely frustrating process to find that consultants and contractors were dealing with people in the end clients who didn't really understand how to do a fair determination. And then leading on to that, so what can be done about that? Independent third parties taking assessments, that'd be like Kingsbridge, ranked really highly for contractors and consultants. So they're very cynical about using the CES tool, very cynical even about the big four consultancy firms undertaking assessments, which we saw a lot of, because the fundamental feeling there is, well, it's in their interest to determine as many people inside R35 as possible to then, kind of sell additional services. And obviously, it's a very cynical view, but you've got to understand that was how contractors and consultants felt when they felt they're getting these unfair determinations from large organisations. And the final bit was the transparency. It's just letting the contractors and consultants know what the approach is going to be, how the determination is going to be done, understanding the appeals process. So remember that there's got to be an appeals process there, and there weren't enough end clients who were implementing appeals processes. So that's the kind of the four things. So fair R35 determination is really important to consultants and contractors, and those are the 4 points that make up a fair determination.
With clients obviously having this added burden now, and with the guidance from HMRC, really, it's sparse to kind of say the least. What do you think the compliance approach from HMRC is going to look like with regards to end clients? And do you feel that clients are concerned or worried that that's going to happen straight away? Obviously, the revenue did say they would have the kind of soft landing, but with it being delayed, you could probably argue that the soft landing is the actual delay itself. So what's your take on how you kind of see this actually being managed by the revenue?
Yeah, my kind of personal opinion is just get it right, and it doesn't really matter. So get it right, get robust assessments in place, and make sure that that's echoed through your organisation, and then you don't really have to think too hard about what HMRC's enforcement approach is going to be. And it's the same thing when we advise our clients. It's very, very rare that we get our clients get investigated by HMRC, because we work really hard to make sure that they are compliant. And if you are compliant, then what does it really matter? But then to answer your question, what are HMRC going to do? I think it's one of those things is that HMRC they're increasingly becoming very clever, and they understand how to find kind of almost sacrificial taxpayers, as it were, to demonstrate points, as we've seen with these high-profile presenter cases. I suspect it is no accident that HMRC have been zooming in on presenters because, the figures involved are quite large, but actually there's a lot of IT contractors out there who are in a similar position. So it's whether HMRC will be looking to, if they feel that they've got a compliance gap, whether they'll be looking to find examples of where they can make a very gain a very public victory to kind of send a message to other people in similar sectors. But whether that's going to be likely or not, because I think enough people know now that they need to really talk about and sort out their IR35 compliance. So I'd be very surprised if we see any kind of large tier clients who are caught up with HMRC when it comes to IR35, because I think the majority of those companies have taken the right approach to IR35, and then it'll be kind of working down that list and looking at the smaller firms and whether HMRC are going to start to investigate them in the way that they would do for any other problem when it comes to tax.
I know one thing that Andy Vessey's stressed, certainly from Kingsbridge, it's really a case of making the industry, both contractors and then clients and agencies to some respect, aware that there really is no stigma attached to being looked at by HMRC. If HMRC open a IR35 inquiry and challenge the status of a group of workers, there is no stigma attached to that, as long as the end client, the recruitment agency, has a solid process for actually determining status, good terms within their contracts, good working practices, a good package of evidence, a robust insurance policy if they want to go down that route. These are the sorts of things that will make that defence much easier and make the process of handling that inquiry a lot smoother. Matt, in your experience and thinking ahead to what agencies and end clients should be doing for their contractors, what do you think they should be doing right now to prepare for the reform for the contractor base that they have? And then going forward, any new contractors, what's that process likely to look like to ensure the contractors have a fair process?
Sure. So I'd say step number one, most importantly, is assess your current knowledge on IR35. If your consultants who are engaging contractors don't know much about IR35 and they're the ones filling in the questionnaire, then you could run into problems straight from the off. One of the things that HMRC makes very clear about duty of care and sort of taking reasonable care and coming to your conclusions is that the individuals undertaking the assessments have to have a reasonable knowledge of IR35. So first and foremost is a education piece to make sure that your staff, the agency staff, actually know at least enough about IR35 to be getting on with, and then potentially engaging a third party or a more senior position to be overall responsible for IR35. There's absolutely nothing stopping agencies, clients, etc., engaging a third party to deal with the IR35 aspects of their engagements, so long as the agencies and the clients are well informed of the process and they're aware of it and they're happy with the process and all that sort of jazz. That's the important bit when it comes to step number one, sort of knowing where you stand, knowing your weak spots and working to fix that. Second is, I guess, identifying what method you want to use in terms of determining contractor status. Are you happy using an internal process you've come up with? Are you happy using HMRC's own tool, CEST, a third-party service like ours, for example? There is a whole range of solutions that an agency can or a client can use to determine status. It doesn't have to be CEST. It doesn't have to be a process you've come up with. It could be an amalgamation of two different things, so long as you're happy and you're confident with the results that are coming out of it. That's the key bit. Then going forward, once you've got the knowledge under your belt and you've got a robust method for dealing with determining status, you should be in a very good position to consider engaging contractors going forward or to properly assess your client base. One thing I would stress, and has been pointed out here in this webinar so far, is it's important that it is transparent for the contractors. One of the very big things that we get, and was reflected in the stats that James put out a little bit earlier, is the fact that contractors do not like feeling they're being left in the dark. So if you're open and transparent with your contractor base, you're going to get essentially happier contractors irrespective of what the outcome is, which is always a very important thing, because it cuts down ultimately on the amount of admin that the agencies and the clients will need to do off the back of any IR35 status determination.
We've got a few FAQs that I'd like to fire at both of you. I think what we'll do is probably get a kind of short, condensed answer from both of you, or if you want to expand on it, by all means, continue. So first of all, James, if you want to kick us off, the question is, what can I do if I get an outside IR35 status result, but my end client puts me inside IR35?
Yeah, I think I mean, the starting point will be to understand where that difference has come from. Engage the client, see if you can open up that channel for communication. So at the start of this year, we had a few clients in that position. It was actually surprising the number of clients who, so contractors and consultants, engaged with their own clients, had those conversations, and got a third party involved and managed to get those determinations to be outside IR35. So first and foremost, have a chat with your client or your agent, understand where you've got that difference of opinion, and then start to think what you can do to work towards that right determination.
Perfect. We'll put some pressure on you, Matt. I think. How likely am I to have an HMRC inquiry opened against me?
The reality is that HMRC don't open a lot of inquiries per year in relation to IR35. What it is fair to say, though, is if they do launch an inquiry against you, they usually have a very good reason for doing so. So it is important that you have a handle on your IR35 situation, because, yes, you're not terribly likely to get picked, all said and done, but that hope that you aren't going to get picked will not protect you if you do end up getting investigated from an IR35 perspective. So you should at least consider your status at any given time. Always going to be my advice, is to consider your status and do your duty of care to your own company.
Next one for you then, James. I'm worried about my end client's IR35 process. Is there anything I can do?
I think that it depends on your client. I think, again, so think about what happened at the start of this year. There are many people in that position who were worried about the process and they didn't feel like they had much power or much influence. But then remember, that was where the power of off-payroll.org.uk came from, because a lot of contractors and consultants then went to share their poor experiences on that site. And that is now a lasting record of who's hot and who's not when it comes to engaging with fair clients. So if you feel like you're getting locked out from your clients and you're not getting anywhere, remember you can talk about your experiences anonymously on offpayroll.org.uk, and hopefully you can put some kind of pressure there in terms of those fair determinations. But saying that, we've also had many examples of consultants and contractors, particularly with smaller clients, working together to get the right determination. So just because you've had that verdict, or you're not confident in the process, doesn't mean to say that you can't influence it and support the client to help them understand what a fairer process looks like.
Yeah, and likewise, if you are using a tool such as ours, there is the capability of the consultant that had the review talking you through the result and liaising with the end client or the agency on your behalf to sort of educate them on IR35 if it ends up being a lack of understanding somewhere in the mix.
Yes.
If it is a genuine sort of no, for example, off the top of my head, and not necessarily this is the only reason a contractor would be inside of IR35, but if it is a genuine, like, no, you can't substitute, and the client does understand it, then, fair enough in that case. But if it's because the client doesn't understand how substitution works, that's somewhere where a consultant such as us, for example, can help explain that to the end client, or explain that to the contractor if it's actually an fault from the contractor's side of things. Education is a really big pointer when it comes to IR35. A lot of people aren't terribly familiar with the legislation, which can lead to some errors, shall we say, when coming to conclusions. But they're not usually insurmountable.
The next question is one that I've been asked a number of times. And Matt, I'm sure you have, and James, I'm almost certain you have. So we'll get some answers from both of you. But Matt first. My contract is outside of IR35. My client said that I'm inside of IR35 after April. Am I more likely to have a HMRC inquiry, and will HMRC view my status differently after April?
HMRC's official answer is no, that they won't treat a inside determination after April as being a reason to investigate. But again, as mentioned previously, if HMRC have a good reason for it, well, if HMRC do investigate you, they'll have a good reason for doing so. So what they can use is information from before April to investigate you for that engagement. It just won't specifically investigate you for that flip in determination in April. But if you are walking and talking like an employee up to April and continue to do so afterwards, then HMRC might investigate you on that basis. They just won't investigate you simply because the client has now classed you as being inside of IR35.
Yeah, and I absolutely echo that point as well. And this gets talked about a lot, which is, should people look to change their client before April 2021, and obviously, in a perfect world where you could easily walk from one client to the other and have that clean kind of firewall between you, then great. But not everybody's going to be in that position. But it comes back to that thing about, if you were confident about your status beforehand and you feel that actually your end client has been overly cautious, then there probably isn't a huge amount to worry about. But then also remember, so I'll kind of plug on your guys' behalf, is remember there are insurance companies out there who can kind of support you, can take out IR35 insurance. So if it is something that really worries you, we'll transfer that risk to somebody else. Take out an IR35 insurance policy, and just get on and do what you need to do. But it is a hot topic of conversation, and there's the point there about the number of HMRC investigations are relatively low, but then also let's consider the mindset that HMRC have got, and the challenge that we've now got ahead of us in the economy, in terms of there's a big black hole there in terms of the UK's finances, and you would think that being sharp on compliance is something that HMRC are going to look at as a way to contribute towards closing some of that gap. It's something to be aware of. Just because you go from outside to inside isn't automatically going to trigger something with HMRC. It may well be that your end client is just being overly cautious or doesn't quite understand the nuances of IR35. But it is something to I think just to think through and make sure you've got the confidence in your current status.
Yeah, and just two more things to add on to that. One of the earlier points around basically having a clean cut from your client and coming back to you to a different client later. One other thing that comes up quite often from my perspective is people saying, well, should I end my contract with the client and then start a new contract with the same client after April? It's not really going to make much difference from an R35 perspective. HMRC will just look straight through that and think, well, it's just one continuous engagement. So there's no real benefit to doing it that way. But the second point I was going to make, if you are in doubt as to your status from an R35 perspective and you'd like to get a third-party opinion on it, there is a recently released contract tool that we have that will help you basically work out your IR35 status.
So that brings me nicely on to the last question that I'll put both of you on the spot for. I'm looking at assessing my status, and my client has told me to use CEST. If I don't have confidence in it, what other solutions are there for me to go and use?
Well, yeah, there's a whole range of solutions out there. As I mentioned earlier, CEST is not the be-all and end-all when it comes to IR35 status determination. There's a Kingsbridge status tool that we obviously operate ourselves, which is the way we've managed it is it's essentially a best of both worlds situation. There's the automation of an inside-outside opinion if it's very clear cut. But if there's an indeterminate in the middle, if you're uncertain of your status, then at that point, someone from my team, the R35 Consultancy team, will have a look at the contractor's individual status and make a determination from there. If it's still unclear at that point, we'll have a conversation with the relevant parties, and essentially we won't rest until we get a determination. That middle ground, that indeterminate area, is ultimately where CEST falls down, because CEST cannot and will not give an opinion if it's indeterminate. They just sit there and say, sorry, don't know. And that's not very helpful to anyone.
Yeah, and I think so in terms of when we talk to our clients. So even as an accounting firm has been in this market for 10 years, we won't undertake direct assessments ourselves because it is just such a very specific matter, and it falls more into law than it does accountancy. And we do say to our clients, fine, kind of you can use assess, but don't be surprised if it comes out with a verdict that you don't quite agree with. And there's three kind of main companies that we talk about where they can go and get a third-party assessment. But the thing to hammer home, we've just mentioned there, is that that there's automated tools out there where you have to kind of be clear about what question's being asked and what answer you're providing for it to then mechanically come up with a determination for you. But the very next question that you've got is, right, so if you're not happy with the result, why and what can I do about it? And that's where the value then comes from, being able to pick up the phone and talk to an expert and actually talk through your determination, understanding where the problems are, understanding what you can do as an individual to overcome those things, or the conversations that you could have with a client to start things moving in the right direction. So yeah, assess an automated tool. There's other automated tools out there. I think you'll go so far with an automated tool, but the reality is you'll probably then end up with more questions than you have answers, and that's when it's great to be able to pick up the phone to an expert who can point in the right direction.
So Matt, you mentioned there, this week sees the launch of the Kingsbridge status tool, which is the contractor-facing version of the solution that we offer here at Kingsbridge. Mm-hmm. Do you want to give the listeners a indication of kind of what that process would feel like? And as James says there, do you have the ability, or do Kingsbridge offer the ability for the contractor to pick up the phone and speak to an expert?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it is key to any sort of proper IR35 consultancy is that there is a true understanding of how the contract is operating. Automated tools are fantastic in their own right, but they'll never get that feel for how a contract is operating unless they ask hundreds of questions, which frankly will take a very long time to answer, and even then might not give a clear-cut response. The Kingsbridge status tool that's being released, essentially the way that will work is it asks you a series of questions, considerably less than a fully automated one would do, and if after those series of questions it determines that you have very clearly inside or outside, it will provide you with the result there and then, and the documentation to go along with it to clearly show that result. If you fit into that middle ground, then it's at that point that, as I said previously, an assessor will step in, have a look at your situation and determine whether or not then you're inside or outside of IR35. Our business is not to force or ensure that you're going to be an inside or an outside. Specifically, we're not pushing for people to be outside. We're pushing to ensure that the determinations are fair and accurate, and that they're kind of accepted by all parties in the contractual chain. Because, again, highlighting earlier information, that ultimately is what contractors want to see, and it's what has to be provided.
Yeah, and in terms of these tools and getting these assessments, our clients saying, right, what should I do between now and April 2021? And the first point, and we've spoken about this, which is we're telling our clients to actually increase your knowledge about IR35, go off and get a good understanding of how status is determined. But we're actually recommending that our clients go off and get a status determination of their current contract. So if they think they're going to tick over in April 2021 and still be with that same client, go off and get a determination now and understand your position. So there's no surprises come April 2021, but also it gives you more time to think about what your response would be, changing working practices between now and April 2021. If your client gives you a determination that you're not happy with, it means that you're ready to go. You've thought about it, you're prepared, and you've got the evidence to go with it. Say, actually, this is why I think that the determination is different to what you think it is. So there is no harm in going out there and getting a determination sooner rather than later, because the more knowledge that you've got and the more you start to put things in place now, the better your chance of being able to influence that decision come April 2021.
Perfect. I can see we've got loads of questions obviously coming through on the comments section there, so we'll get to those in just a moment. But before we jump into that, I'd just like to thank you, James, for obviously coming on to the webinar today. It's been a real insight, obviously having your expertise on here as well. Where can people find you and the things that you're up to? I've seen you doing quite a lot on LinkedIn with the kind of myth busting. So where can people get hold of you if they want to get in touch?
Yeah, so it's super straightforward. So if you want to see our IR35 related content, so our point of view, we are gunning for consultants and contractors who should be working and able to work outside IR35. So if you want to see our myth busting, our tips on navigating between now and April 2021, just go to ir35.to.2. So ir35.to, and that will land you straight in the right page on our website to give you all the information that you need about IR35. And of course, there's also offpayroll.org.uk. You can go to the site and see what clients are up to with status determinations, and we've got a LinkedIn page with all the latest information on there as well.
Excellent, perfect. So we're just going to put the channel on mute for a second whilst we let a few more of these questions filter through. So we'll move on to those in just one moment. Okay, just before we get into the questions that you're sending through, I'd like to apologise for obviously the technical issues at the very start of the webinar. I understand that there was a couple of difficulties in actually hearing us at the very start, but I can assure you that a full recording of the webinar will be sent after we finish, so you can obviously see the start if you did actually miss anything at the very beginning there. So the first question then that I'll put over to you, Matt, I think, with actually a question from Richie. So with reference to minor status tests on a longer contract, what should the approach be when agreeing holiday terms that will be taken during the contract period?
Simply put with that, it should just be the case of the contractor yourself will just tell the client when you're taking the time off. You may discuss it with them out of courtesy, but it should be precisely that, courtesy. If the client's controlling you in any way in terms of when you take holiday, that won't look good from an IR35 perspective. If it ends up being the case that, say, for example, you say, oh yeah, I'm going to be off on the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th and 5th, and the client says, oh, well, we've really got a big deadline on the 5th, could you reconsider? And you negotiate, chop and change, whatever, that's fine, because that's a discussion between equals in that case. It's not the client saying, no, you can't take that time off. It's just a case of them saying, could you perhaps reconsider? So again, showing more of a business-to-business relationship than a one-way street like you would get as an employee.
Perfect, lovely. So next question then is from Chris, just with regards to training. Most organisations now require all staff and also contractors to complete a variety of online compliance and behaviour training such as health and safety, security, etc. What's the impact of these types of kind of in-house training on IR35 status for limited company contractors?
Okay, so my usual advice when it comes to training is that if it's for legally required matters or if it's industry standard, so everybody in your industry is required to undertake that training irrespective of how they're engaged, then it's going to be defendable from an IR35 perspective. So if it's health and safety, data protection, anything like that, it's going to be fine. If it's anything that you can make use of in a later engagement, so let's say, for example, you're an IT contractor and your client's offering you training on a new programming language, that is going to be stepping over the line, because you could then use that in a job later on to effectively earn more money or improve your skill set. So that's where the line will be drawn. But if it's health and safety, for example, everyone needs to do that, so HMRC probably won't grumble at that.
Perfect. Just a very quick one from Simon. Yes, Simon will be sending out the slides from the actual webinar as well, so you have both the audio and the slides of the entire session, no problem. So the next question's from, well, there's no name on this one actually. I use a end client's email. Does this affect my IR35 status?
It can do. The question you want to be asking there is precisely why do you use the client's email? If it's because of security, so data protection and that sort of thing, then it could be defendable. But the question there would be exactly as how the email is formatted. Are you very clearly visible as being a contractor, or are you sort of seen as being part and parcel of the client's organisation? So it really is two-pronged. In essence, are you using it because you're required to use it or because it's convenient? And if you are using it because you're required to use it because of data protection, you just need to make sure that you're identifiable as a contractor.
Lovely. Another very quick one. So are statements of work a way around IR35?
I mean, if done correctly, they can be, and there's not really a way around IR35. The legislation, the way that the legislation operates as of April, is that it's for end clients, it's if they're medium or large end clients, that they have to determine IR35 status. Without getting too much into statement of works, the idea there being that the medium or large end client basically gives out the work to a small end client who becomes the contractor's ultimate end client. So that small end client becomes the contractor's client, not the medium or large company sat behind it. If that's done correctly, then in that situation, it stays with the contractor to determine their IR35 status. If it's not done correctly, and I suspect that most people trying to do it to dodge IR35 will probably not do it correctly, then the Section 10 still applies.
Perfect. So another one here from Tony. Irrespective of working through an agency or end client direct, how will the new changes affect working for a non-UK based company? I'm currently working for both a Swiss and USA client whilst I'm based in the UK.
So this one's another tricky one, really. The current understanding of it is if the non-UK entity has absolutely no UK ties, then it falls back on the current legislation, which is that the contractor determines their own status. If that end client, that non-UK end client, has a UK company in its wider group or has some tie to the UK in terms of a company connection, then HMRC will simply go to that UK arm and ask them to deal with it. So again, it's something really for the client to decide rather than you as a contractor in that situation.
Perfect. So we've got time for a couple more then. This one's no name on this one actually. I work through an intermediary for my end client. The intermediary has asked me for my assessment of IR35 status. Should I do this or ask them for my assessment of my status first?
It depends. If they're asking you for your current status, really none of their business. It's none of their business until April 2021. If they're asking you for your opinion on your status after April 2021, then that's their job to provide that, not yours. I would probably ask them why they want it before doing anything on it. And then if they give a reasonable explanation, say, for example, they want to get your take on it, then again, it could be for transparency purposes. They're just trying to make things fair and equitable between both parties.
Perfect. Again, from no name. What if my client or employer does not give me an IR35 status determination ahead of April?
Short and sweet, they have to. If they don't, they're being negligent and they could be liable to get a fine if they're a medium or large end client. It rests initially with the end client. If the end client can demonstrate they've taken reasonable care in coming to a conclusion, even if it is the wrong conclusion, but they've gone down the correct route of getting that determination, then it bounces down the contractual chain to the fee payer. So if the client's being obstinate and saying they're not going to provide you one, you need to just inform them that they could be liable for a fine if they don't.
Perfect. And I think I'll just add on that as well. If you do not receive an STS or an assessment from your end client, it is worth just checking to see if the end client satisfies the small company exemption rules. It may be that the end company or end client does qualify as a small company, but they've just simply not told you. And if that is the case, then obviously they should be in a position to actually clarify the company size with you. And the final one, again, apologies that we can't answer more of these. We've simply run out of time. But the last one, Matt, will HMRC investigate previous years or just the current contract that I'm on?
HMRC can investigate more or less whatever they want. There is around a 6-year period whereby HMRC can backdate their reviews. They'll only go that far back if they've got a very good reason for doing so. Generally, I believe the advice is if you sort of cover yourself for the last 4 to 6 years, you'll be fine from an IR35 perspective, or at least you'll have got all the relevant information, etc. Yeah, HMRC can look back at previous tax years as well as current ones. There's nothing stopping them doing that.
Excellent. Well, I think what we'll do then is just wish everyone thank you for joining us. What we will be doing is following up on the email that we send with the actual webinar recording with a whole host of these other questions that have come in. There are quite literally hundreds, so we'll try and cover off as many of those as we can. And certainly, if there are any questions whatsoever, feel free to send an email to ir35@kingsbridge.co.uk, and we'll endeavour to get back to any of those questions that we can. But thank you for joining us today, and once again, if there's any kind of follow-up, then by all means get in touch with Kingsbridge.